Hello guys, welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I have an honor to talk to someone that I love. But before that, just make sure you hit the subscription button, you comment, you like and share. It is an honor, guys, to be joined by a professor at Wits University and author, Professor Tanja Sakota. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. And you?
I'm also fine.
Good. Thank you for this opportunity.
I'm the one who's blessed here actually to have you. Today we are here in my platform as an author. So for someone who doesn't know who Tanja is, how can you tell us?
That's a good question because I have multiple facets and I see myself in multiple ways. I've been involved in academic teaching for most of my adult life. And I'm very passionate about the work I do with my students because I'm actually the inspiration for the book came through student conversations and how students were interacting with academia and how they wanted to find their own agency in learning. So that was the motivation for the book, but it motivates me every day. And I've got a message at the end of my film to my students, and I say thank you for motivating and inspiring me every day, and that's absolutely true. Apart from that, but I carry my work with me in all that I do. If you look at the book, if you look at my teaching, if you look at the film, they're all intertwined. I bring it into my own private space as a mother as well, how I interact with the world. The book also goes in terms of autoethnography, so it shows how I deal with myself as a human being in relation to the questions that I'm asking my students as well.
In the book, Uncovering Memory, you're talking about you being inspired by students to read the book, right? And one of the events that actually inspired you to write the book is Rhodes Must Fall. In which way Rhodes Must Fall inspired you to start writing the book?
It inspired me because, and I talk about the moment when the protests are happening in Cape Town, and I come into my master's classroom, which is a seminar-based classroom, and everyone's looking on their phones and they're looking at the protests that are happening in Cape Town at UCT. And we start a conversation and we start talking about what is happening at UCT and what does that mean today? What does it mean for students at Wits in Johannesburg? How are they identifying with the anger, with the hurt, with the pain of something like the statue of Rhodes? And it starts making me think in terms of academia within the film and television department. That very same year, we piloted our BA in film and television. And it was a new degree. We thought about transformation. We thought about transforming pedagogy in this new degree already. So we were already on the road. But it was that moment that really started making me think personally, not only about how we learn, how we teach, but the very space that we teach in. And for me, filmmaking gives a lot of freedom because you can go out and you can go out of the space. You can go out of this reminder, physical, geographic reminder of the past, and you can use a camera to engage with it. So that was kind of the inspiration and the starting point of how do we look at the spaces that we navigate? What does it mean for different individuals? Because when we come into a classroom space, we're all coming with our own personal histories. And for me, with students, especially within the practical courses, we need to understand who we are in the space before we can talk about creativity, before we can talk about theoretical concerns or ideas or paradigms. We need to understand who we are in the space. And Rhodes Must Fall kind of concretized that because it showed the necessity of it, not just something that I was doing with students. And for me, it was a moment where this needed to be discussed on a bigger platform. I wanted to give a voice. I use student films in the book because I also wanted to give, these are films that are done as exercises and they're not the kind of things that are entered into film festivals or taken further. But for me, they're so pertinent and the learning is so interesting in the exercises. I mean, they're short films. They're like 1 to 2 minutes. But for me, the questions that are being asked through these very short clips are where we really can start to engage. And it was, how can, being an academic, I was already writing journal articles. How could I give a platform to my students in terms of the work that they were creating? And then there was a lot of stuff, and it wasn't just an article. It was a journey, and I wanted to write about the journey.
What is the importance of really uncovering memories or tracing your roots? And the second question is, in the first chapter of the book, you share about your experience when you moved to Poland. When you traveled to Poland, you entered in this building, whereby when you describe, you hear some voices, and in your description, you're saying these are not usually the voices of people that are currently present, but these are memories of your ancestors. Take me through that journey of you uncovering these memories in that building and in those trees that you're walking.
Okay, so in terms of the first question, why the past? And
Yes.
it's very interesting because this very week I've been doing some reading about how the past needs to stay in the past, and we need to focus on the present, and we need to focus on the future. And I think that, considering South Africa's past and history, we can't. We can't. We have to understand and acknowledge its existence. And for me, South Africa is a unique space because it needs to do that. I see that with students, that we need to acknowledge, we need to understand our presence, we need to understand our past experiences, what we're bringing to the classroom, because it shapes the types of films we make. And being in a university setting, the films are not flat, they're very layered, and they deal with very psychological, historical, social, and political issues. And because of that, we cannot just leave it in the past. So that's why memories for me is important, and memory studies. So why I go to Poland was, as I was navigating the book, and as I'd had an idea of what the book would be, and I knew that I would work with students, I would work with colleagues in different scenarios, but it wouldn't be fair not to work with myself, because how can you put people through an experience of tormenting or traumatic memory, whether it's historical, political, cultural, or social? Within that, you're going into personal memory. How could I do that with my students and not do it to myself? I had to go on my own journey. So what I did was, the interesting thing is, for me, the book is written not as a book. It's written like a film script, because that's what I know. So it's a circular narrative where we have a starting point. We go kind of backwards in the journey, and then we come back to that starting point, and then we take the journey on my own journey. So it's kind of the circular narrative that I know from filmmaking, not from novel or book writing or even academic writing. And the other thing was that I found that students don't find academic writing accessible. They find it very disorientating, and they find it very disassociating, almost like what Rhodes was in that space at UCT. So I wanted to blur boundaries, and you know me as a teacher, I like to blur all the boundaries. I wanted to blur the boundaries of writing, academic writing, thinking, and filmmaking and storytelling. So the book is not written as an academic book. It takes you on that journey. So it starts like a novel, but the theoretical concepts and the kind of, it's the preamble of really what is to come and how we look at memory. But it's done in a way that is accessible in terms of reading, because I want students to engage with the kind of the theoretical paradigms of memory studies and the different facets of memory studies. But through it, I want them to be somewhat entertained, and I'll put that in inverted commas. I mean it in the emotional experience of filmmaking. So I start in Poland. What became pertinent for me was that, okay, so maybe I need to give a little bit of background. The story in the film I make is about the forced migration of my parents from Europe to South Africa. My mother was born in 1942, which was kind of the more towards the beginning of the midpoint of the Second World War. She was born in what was then a country, part of Germany, in a province called Silesia. And by the end of that war, she had to move. There were decisions that were made in the Potsdam Conference, which redefined the borders of Europe post-Second World War. And those borders, within those borders, there were three politicians, Churchill, Truman, and Stalin, who met in Potsdam in Germany in beautiful villas amongst these beautiful trees. And within this landscape, they decided the new borders of Europe. And I took both journeys. I went to Potsdam, but I started, I went to Poland. And in Poland, so let me explain why it's now Poland. So in that conference, Stalin had taken territories that were linked to Belarus, Ukraine, and Lithuania. He'd occupied those territories and he wanted the people to move. So in order to move those people out, he proposed that Silesia, which was the province of Germany, would be incorporated into the new borders of Poland. The Germans in Silesia would move within the new borders of Germany. They would be forced out. And those people of those occupied territories would move into Poland. So on paper, it was just a moving of people down and a moving of people up. But what it really meant was the movement of 15 million people who were just relocated. So for me, and they were relocated into places that were burnt, bombed, destroyed. And they had to pick the pieces up and make their own, carry on with their lives. So I go back to Poland. I find through birth certificates and death certificates and marriage certificates, I find the old German addresses online. And I find a website that translates the old addresses to the new Polish addresses. And I find the locations of where my mother was born and where her parents lived, my great-grandparents, where they lived, the area where, and I go into the book in terms of where my great-grandfather was buried.
Now it's a park.
It's a park. During the war, it's a park with a playground and tennis courts. And I go back to these places initially to see what I can find in terms of finding the locations and seeing what it means for me emotionally. So I start the book in Poland that's my first visit in terms of, my plane touches down, I hire a car, I get the navigator and I go to this first place, which is the building where my mother was born, where she grew up for those first 2 years. When she was born, and she doesn't remember exactly, and my grandparents have passed. So there was a certain amount of time that my mother lived in this building, but my great-grandparents had a delicatessen shop on the ground floor. And I go back to this space, remembering how my mother and my grandmother, my grandfather explained the place. And trying to sort forensically to look at where was the shop, where can I find the frames. I'm looking at things like this, but what I'm really hearing is all of a sudden I go in the building. So this is outside. I go in the building and I see that the staircase and the floor is original. It's from the 1920s, 1930s. And I realize that this is the same floor my ancestors walked on, my mother walked on. And all of a sudden, I'm looking through my camera because I'm filming on a mobile phone. And I'm looking through my camera and all of a sudden, by default, the voices start speaking to me. So I'm seeing my mother. I'm seeing what she remembers. I'm remembering my grandmother's stories. I'm imagining my grandmother carrying my mother as a baby up the staircase. And I'm realizing that if I were to touch the staircase, somewhere where I touch, underneath the layers of all the people that have touched the staircase and the layers of paint, is that moment where my grandmother most probably touched that staircase. And then I look around and I realize that the walls have witnessed the moment I'm hearing in my head. And I realize that all of a sudden my location is my character, my landscape, my eyewitness. So I take this journey in terms of urban spaces, But then as I work through the atrocities that happened on both my mother's and my father's side, I start finding perpetrators alongside that. So I won't go into great detail. I'll leave it for the readers to read. But I go on this journey through the journey that my mother took as she was evicted, as she went through Germany and then was relocated to South Africa. And I go on my father's journey, who was in Eastern Europe in a province called Herzegovina, which is now part of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I think about the events that happened to my father and to my grandfather. And again, in those spaces, the village that my father grew up in was completely destroyed in the war in the 1990s that broke up the former Yugoslavia. So what I realize in my journey as I remap the journey and I take the journey, I start realizing the mass migration that happened of people through trains, moving through forests. I see my mother moving through the forest. I see the stories of my father when I go in the areas that he went through. And I start realizing in the same way that the building was my eyewitness, the forests and nature and everything around me are my eyewitness. So what I was asking students to do when Rhodes was falling in South Africa, in Johannesburg specifically, to go out and find the memories of the past through location, landscape, and space and place, that is not only confined to the urban space, it's the rural space, it's the places of nature, it's the streets, it's the cobble on streets, it's the sand, it's the trees, it's the forests, it's the rivers. So all spaces become characters within film.
One of the topic or subjects that are very important, which you touch in your book, is about decolonizing education. You talk about the events that took place in the film and TV department, saying that film and TV as a degree has been under dramatic arts for a very long time until 2015, whereby it decided to be isolated as an independent degree. So what do you mean when you talk about decolonizing education in the book?
For me, decolonizing education exists, as I said, on many facets. Yeah. It starts with the individual and the individual understanding and having their own definition of what that means. Yeah. It then moves to the classroom space and the interaction amongst the people within the classroom space, bringing those different definitions to the space. But then it's also about the preparation of before that classroom, before you go into the classroom. So it's how do we look at courses? How do we look at material that goes in courses? But not only about how do we prepare courses, but how do we engage with that material? So for me, and that's where, for me, you have to look at memory and you have to look at the past, because part of decolonizing is acknowledging, but it's about not coming, Bell Hooks talks about the margins and speaking from the position of the margins. For me, I see it as moving those margins to the center and disrupting from the center out. So it's disrupting everything that was previously considered the core and the center of what knowledge is, who the canons are, how they should be engaged with. So for me, like in the book where I challenge academic writing and writing it with as a novel, for me, the very process of learning is that we can decolonize education through the process itself. So that's why I engage with something like practice-based research, where it's not about reading, getting an authority, thinking about it, and then putting it into practice. It's go out, take a camera, come back, and then let's talk about what you're doing. And then let's find relevance of what you're doing to what someone else has written or someone else is thinking. So it's not about a framework that is imposed and conditions the way you think, the way you write, the way you film. It's go film, find your authenticity in it, and then say, how do I find relevance in what I'm saying with what others are saying?
One of the things that you touch in the book is genocide. You talk about it a lot. And in this genocide, you talk about TRC in South Africa, you talk about Latin American model, which was developed in the US. You talk about a certain way that I don't know how to pronounce it, and it is a model in Germany that was used after. It's the same way
The
that it was.
Nuremberg trials. In
Yes,
terms,
the
yeah.
term. What is this that model actually was formed for?
Okay, so the Nuremberg model was formulated post Second World War to bring to accountability the perpetrators of the genocide against the Jewish people in the Holocaust, or the Shoah. And it was about retribution, in the sense, bringing accountability in terms of the actual perpetrators and what they were accountable for. In terms of South Africa, we moved towards a system that was more that was centered around the TRC, was
Amnesty.
And how do we bring perpetrators? How do we reconcile a nation that has to? So, for example, if you compare it to the Germany situation, a lot of the Jewish people post Second World War moved out of Germany. They moved into different areas all over the world. A lot went to the States. So it wasn't, and 6 million people were murdered. And it was about finding accountability, but it was a slightly different scenario, in the sense that a lot of the people that survived the Holocaust and the Shoah moved out of Germany. South Africa had to find, in many ways, this idea of unity, and that's where this false idea of a rainbow nation came. Although Archbishop Desmond Tutu originally spoke about it as a political tool and mechanism, in terms of how he was addressing the apartheid government, when he said, look at all the colors, look at the rainbow colors. Post-apartheid, and when we were in democracy, it started being used as this kind of marketing tool of uniting people. And the TRC, what it did was it gave amnesty to the perpetrators. So you had to come to the TRC, you had to show remorse, and some were granted amnesty, and those that didn't show remorse weren't granted amnesty. And South Africa then moved on in relation to performing as a nation, as an identity. But then post, if you look, like, we're nearly into our third decade of democracy, those ruptures of the TRC are coming through very strongly now. And I think it's always, the ghosts always come out of the closet, and I think that is what's happening.
When you continue talking further about genocide and the history of your parents and some other genocide that took place all over the world, you talk about excavating ghost perpetrators and victims.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Okay, so for me, the whole journey of my ancestors and my parents was, what I was realizing was, as I was engaging and trying to find evidence in the different places, what I was really trying to do was, I was excavating forensically, but I wasn't looking for, like, the archaeologist who looks for the evidence, or the paleontologist who looks for the bone, or the archaeologist who looks for the cup, or the the rock painting or the rock art. I wasn't looking for things like that. I was looking for the ghosts. I was looking for the memories of the people who inhabited those places. But in that journey, my identity changed in different spaces. So how I was viewed in terms of being someone of German origin in Poland today, and I talk about an incident with a man, I call him the man at the window. I was seen as a perpetrator. Yet this land, this building, this property was just taken. So I navigate different instances in terms of when I'm a perpetrator and a victim. And it comes very clearly in the story when I'm in a town called Stolets, and I'm trying to gain access in 1997 to the village where my father grew up. And this is post. So 1997 is post the war that broke up the former Yugoslavia, and the political tensions are very high. I'm going into a mined region and I need a UN escort because I'm not allowed to go by myself. And I won't go into it. It's very clearly articulated in the book in terms of that very moment when the police in the town of Stolac are deciding whether they're going to give me access or not into this space. And I uncover and I remember the incident in terms of how I'm seen in that square, town square, with the people who now inhabit that space and how I see them. So for me, we navigate, we're never only perpetrators and we're never only victims. We're always both. And it's how we are in a space and how we are seen in that space that we negotiate ourselves.
And just towards the end of the book, you talk about moving forward.
Yes. And the book very clearly doesn't have an introduction and a conclusion. Yeah. For me, and I think that's the rebel in me in writing the book, in terms of writing an academic book that defies academic writing on the one hand, but engages with theoretical ideas and concepts in a way that's very accessible. And it brings humanity and our emotions and our feelings and who we are as people as we engage with the theory. So for me, it wasn't about concluding. For me, this is the platform. The end of the book is the starting point for everyone else's journey. So every reader that goes through the book, I'm encouraging them to go on their own journey of uncovering memory. So that is why it's moving forward rather than concluding.
My last question. One of the statements that stuck with me when I was reading the book is when you said that history is amalgamated, and I really want to know what you mean by history being amalgamated. And lastly, one of the things that you touch throughout the book is the statues that were built during apartheid that are still here today, which represent victory to the perpetrators of the majority, and it represent oppression to the majority, which are people of color. So what was the most important thing that touched you for you to be able to talk about that, for you to mention spaces like Constitution Hill, the genocide here in Joburg, the genocide history center? What is the significance of mentioning
Okay,
this?
so for me, first, this idea of history is that, just entering the Apartheid Museum gives you the emotional experience without saying a word in terms of which ticket did you get and which entrance are you going to take. So immediately your experience of the world is defined by that. And when we look at history, even if we look at South Africa is the perfect example. If you look at apartheid and the history that was recorded and the history that was uncovered and exposed and became accessible post 1994 are complete opposites in terms of how they were viewing the events of what was happening. So that is the first thing that I realized. And history is supposedly the official record. In South Africa, we challenge that. What is the official record? Because we know, we've experienced it, we've seen it. For me, what happens is, in the book, I say that with history, it's the his story. It's the third person pronoun. It's told to us in the third person. I'd like to take the history, the his, out of history, and I talk about the I story. So it's not on the one level, it's the recordings, it's the official record of what we see. But when we really start to engage with history, we look at the I story, we look at the individual story and experience. And that is what happens when you look at monuments and memorials.
Genocide,
so
Holocaust.
You look at the genocide, Holocaust and Genocide Center in Johannesburg. It's about the individual stories that really give us access to the past. And we can really understand perpetrators, victims, how we navigate those different identities and roles in relation to our I story. So for me, there's this concept of genocide, there's this concept of atrocity, but we can only, and as filmmakers, we're always tapping into the emotion of the story of the individual. We can only really tap into that when we go into the I story.
Now,
Available on Loot, it's available on Takealot, or you can order it through exclusive books.